All right, folks. Well, last time around we went through and considered the idea of a bash script that could go through and run a single test case that we were interested in on some program under test, where the script to run the test case accepted a bunch of different arguments to go through and say, okay, this is how I want you to run the test case. So it had a slew of different options, like you could use -t and then the name of the file you wanted to test, the name of the program you wanted to test. -i and the name of the file that contains the standard input to be used during the test. -a and a file name, and that file would contain the name, all of the command line arguments that were supposed to be passed to the program that you were testing. -r for and a file name where that file contains the expected status value. So you've just got a whole slew of different test case options that specify the names of different files that contain different pieces of information to be used for that test case. And so again, there were files containing the expected output, the expected standard error output, the expected combined output, the expected status value, the names of scripts to be run before and after the program under test. Right, so a whole slew of different options, in each case provided as -something or other and then a file name. And that file contains the information to be used for that piece of the test. So we wanted to go through and now come up with a technique to go through and test, to run a whole suite of tests. So we'll have a second script that basically says, all right, we'll use that first script for each individual test case, and we'll run it, just a dozen times or 100 times or 1,000 times to run all of the different test cases that the tester wants in this particular batch. So that's the idea. Let's see what we can do in terms of setting it up. So ideally, we want this to be something that's easily configured, where the tester can easily turn around and add new tests or remove tests or change tests. So I don't want to kind of hard code a whole bunch of test cases into this. I don't want my test collection.sh to be just some great long script where the first line is the first call, the first test, the second line is the second test, because it's really easy to mess that up. If you screw up a test case in the middle somewhere, you're going to break your script. If you want to go through and edit it, you've got to very carefully go off and find the right line and edit that line without messing up anything else. It's difficult to, if we wanted to run that script 12 different times with 12 different subsets of test cases, it would be a real pain to try and do that. You start suddenly finding yourself making different versions of the test collection script, and one version for this batch of tests and one for another batch of tests and another one for another batch of tests. So we want something that's more flexible, a little more generic than that. So what we'll do is basically say, well, suppose I had a file for each test case that I wanted to run. And that file will have each of the different options that I want to use. So for one particular test case, my file describing that test case might have -t and the name of the program I'm testing, -i and the name of some file I'm going to use for standard input, -a and the name of some file that's got the command line arguments in it. So the file describing the test case might simply be a whole bunch of individual lines, in each case being -something or other and a file name. And that would have all the information that I really needed to go through and run that individual test case. Right, so I've got one file for each individual test case. And that file contains the names of a whole bunch of other files specifying exactly what that test case involves. So it's relatively easy to go through and add new test cases. I just create one more file, right, with the new information in it. And of course, I'd have to actually go off and to implement the test case, I'd have to create all of the files that it says exists and make sure that they've got the right information in it. But in terms of getting that to work with the tester, it's relatively straightforward. I just have this one kind of coordination file for that test case. And so if I wanted to come up with different collections of test cases, I could put them in different directories. So I could have one directory that had 50 different files in it, each one describing one test case. And another directory that had another 20 or 30 or 50 files in it, each describing one test case. And so what our test collection script could do is say, well, you give me the names of whichever directories you want, and I'll just go through and grab all of the test case files out of each of them and run that suite of test cases right past that set of arguments off to my other tester. So you can see that it wouldn't be difficult to change an individual test case. I'd just go off and edit that one file. It wouldn't be difficult to add new test cases or remove test cases. I just, create one more file in the right directory or remove one more file from the right directory. And all of the supporting data files that actually belong to that test case. But as far as the tester is concerned in terms of the automation part, it's nice and straightforward. And again, the idea of our script to run a whole suite of these things, it's not going to be too terribly complicated. Right? The idea would be we've got our test collection script. We just pass it the names of a whole bunch of directories where each directory has got these description files for the individual test case. And it just goes through each of those directories and runs every test case that it finds in each of those directories. So, of course, it's going to have to go through and do the error checking to make sure that these are actually directories and to make sure they do actually exist, and we've got permissions to use them. And for each of the files, it's going to have to go through each of the files in them and make sure that, okay, yeah, that is actually a readable file, and it's got, the appropriate format, the appropriate content in it to make a call to my script to run an individual test case. But again, that's all fairly mechanical, right? We can do all that in Bash now. It's not that difficult. It's just making sure we sit down and do all of our error checking for it. So our test selection or test collection script might assume that these things each have a whole bunch of directories in them, maybe, or a whole bunch of files in them, and maybe a whole bunch of subdirectories, each containing some test case files. And again, each of these test case files, each of these test description files contains that suite of command line arguments to be passed to our tester to use for one single run of the test. So our script goes through, grabs the next file describing a test case, extracts the information from it, checks it for validity, calls our tester2.sh that we were talking about the other day, and lets it produce the results, and then moves on to the next one. So, for each of the directories, for each of the test description files in that directory, we run the tester and capture and display the results. So, it's assumed that we can do some error checking on the test case description that we were given, but the actual content for those test cases is something that tester2.sh has been set up to deal with, right? It goes through and does whatever voodoo it needs to do to check the data that it's been given. And that's part of the beauty of having our logic split up into two separate scripts here, right? We've got one that's just worrying about how to handle a whole bunch of groups, and it just passes the right data off to the other one to run an individual test case. So we don't have to kind of intermingle the error checking for each of the different portions. Right? We can compartmentalize this a bit, abstract away some of the details. So if we were going to take a look at, again, what the functionality might look like, right? Our script, our test collection script, would essentially be something recursive so that it could go through the subdirectories that it's working with. And it's going to go through and check to make sure that, we've got a directory, it's readable, it's executable, so I can get into it and I can do things with it. And then for every item in that directory, if it's a readable file, we'll use the contents of it to call tester2.sh, right? Passing the arguments that were given in that file, capture and display the results. If it wasn't a file, I guess we should really actually check that it's a readable executable directory and call it recursively. And all that, if you like, the main functionality of the script would be, we've got a recursive function to do this. So all the script has to do beyond that is simply call that with each of the directory names that it was given. Right? So again, it's a relatively straightforward process. This is all stuff that you can do fairly easily now that we've got our kind of basic bash skills up to snuff. So we can go through and come up with a reasonably sophisticated tool for doing our automated testing, right? It's just a matter of kind of the sky's the limit in terms of how complex the individual test cases can get, right? We've got the ability to do all sorts of weird and wonderful things with them. All right, I think that is a good place to leave that one. In the next session, we'll go through and talk a little bit about the actual test case development side of things.